Hi there, my name's Paul Tobin. I'm a senior creative at Wētā Workshop, and I'm also one of the co-creators of GKR, Giant Killer Robots, an original IP by Wētā Workshop. Okay, so today we're going to be talking through our development process on Giant Killer Robots. This is probably going to be a little bit of a long talk, so you might want to grab a hapsy and settle in. I'd also like to do a big shout out to all of my friends and colleagues at Wētā Workshop, Cryptozoic and Trigger, who made GKR a reality. And I'd also like to dedicate this talk to all of our GKR fans. The journey was just made so much better with all your help and support, and we really loved all of the custom designs that you guys would send through to us. Okay, let's get into it. Right, we'll do a little bit of a disclaimer first. So this is not a how to make an IP talk. Rather, we're sharing some insights into our IP process, which you may find helpful or not. This process has been heavily edited and curated into a more educational format to convey some key ideas and concepts, and to make us look a little more organised. I think, as you can see from our little team image there, we don't take ourselves too seriously, but we definitely take our work seriously. And this was a very rare opportunity for us as a group of designers, concept artists. So it was myself, Christian Pearce, and Larry Greer. We were all senior concept artists and art directors at Wētā Workshop. We'd been working together for well over 10 years. Most of us had been at the company for 15. And this opportunity kind of came out of the blue, and we were obviously really excited to be given the opportunity to work on Wētā's first original IP. And I think it's notable to say that even though this original team was quite small, it grew quite large, and I haven't got time to unfortunately credit everyone's involvement, but some of the key players, which I should call out, is Matt Hyra, who was the game designer for GKR at Cryptozoic. Also Ike Harmon, who is our marketing and promotions coordinator, Nicola Booth, who is our production manager, and Joel Savage, who is our lead 3D artist. Two other people that I think really helped bring the world together, not so much maybe the game, but the world, was Liana McPherson, who is our amazing copywriter for the Kickstarter campaign, and also Chris Williamson, who literally brought our world to life through his animated videos. So I guess one of the points I want to make right from the start is you're only as good as your team. And probably when you're first starting out making an IP, I think the thing that we all realised was, at the time, it was a budgetary issue. We just couldn't have a big team. We were all working on full-time film jobs at the time. This was not our dedicated job. And it's one of the reasons why it took so long to complete. But that was actually a huge advantage, because it meant that we used a very small group of people that were very multidisciplinary and very multi-talented. And this, in some ways, I think, helped us work more efficiently and get a more consistent creative vision and product. So I think that's probably the first sort of, tip that we'll sort of pass on. I think it's worth mentioning too that we're pretty new to we'd worked on a lot of properties before, but this was kind of a little new for us in terms of the opportunity. And so we certainly made some mistakes, but we also got quite a few things, I think, pretty right. And so we'll be talking through those as we go. So we're all going to take a little bit of a road trip on this talk. And as I said earlier, it's about the development of the IP. It's not really a talk about the development of the board game or a design to manufacture talk. It's very much just talking more about that initial inception and development of what we consider to be an IP. And I guess by IP, sort of the way that I'm defining that, is it's effectively a world that we've created, which we want to tell engaging stories with amazing characters in. So that was kind of our goal, was to create this world, and that's what we consider to be an IP in this instance. So we're going to talk about the creative opportunity, and we're going to talk a little bit about ideation. We're going to meander our way through early visual development, and then we're going to sort of touch on three key things, which is a really great way of breaking down a project for us, and we do it all the time on live jobs, which is story, character, and world. And then we're going to sort of talk a little bit about reaching your audience, and then finally what next. Okay, so probably before I go any further, I think it's worth, a lot of you might have heard of Wētā Workshop before, but you probably haven't necessarily heard of GKR. And so I think the best option here is to actually show you. And so I want you to watch the 2-minute sort of video that we did for our Kickstarter campaign, which effectively sums up very much all of our sort of efforts to create this world for this board game, but then obviously to create a world that we want to do so much more with. So let's play the video and then come back and continue to chat a little bit more about the development process.
From the ashes of the apocalypse, megacorporations now rise. They battle for salvage rights in Earth's abandoned cities to build a better, brighter future. Welcome to GKR Heavy Hitters, a brand new 2 to 4 player board game set in Wētā Workshop's world of giant killer robots. You play a celebrity-seeking pilot leading your faction of robots to victory. Each pilot has unique abilities and unlocks upgrades during gameplay. These are your giant killer robots. We call them GKRs. 4 factions representing 4 corporations, each armed with state-of-the-art weaponry and tactical systems. And this big one here, that's your heavy hitter, the biggest, baddest mech on the battlefield. Choose your faction and strap in. It's time to rumble. There are 2 ways to win the game, by defeating your opponent in combat or by claiming buildings to demolish and salvage. Your faction deck represents your heavy hitter's health and unique armament and abilities. Each card is an action to attack, react, defend, or move. You get 25 cards. Use them or lose them. But actions cost energy. Spend too much energy and you'll incur damage. Gameplay occurs in rounds. Each round has 5 phases. Begin each round with 6 cards from your draw deck. Deploy your support units. You have 3 to choose from: combat, repair, and recon. Next, move your heavy hitter and support units into a tactical position. Buildings provide both cover and the opportunity to gain sponsorship bonuses and claiming rights. The combat phase is when factions attack and defend against each other. Rather than turn-based order, weapon speed determines who goes first. If you sustain damage, you lose faction cards. Lose all your cards and you're out. But that's not the only way to score. The tagging phase is your chance to assert advertising dominance on the playing field. Place 4 tags on a building and you claim that building. Claim and demolish 4 buildings and you win. Here's another reason to go hard on the tagging. For each building you tag, you earn a sponsor card. You can use these throughout the game to give you a tactical advantage. The last phase is the reset. Draw new cards and replenish your energy for the next round. Victory brings your faction one step closer to global dominance and your pilot on a path to fame and fortune. So don't delay. Join the demolition party now. This message is brought to you by official sponsor Hapsy Corp, who would like to remind you to drink Hapsy.
Right. So now hopefully you're a little bit more up with the play in terms of what GK is about from a sort of IP and product perspective. So as I was saying, it is definitely a board game, and that was where the IP started. But for us, the opportunity was always about creating a world that we could take into lots of different mediums and formats, whether it's comics, books, animated television series, video games, or films. For us, the board game was just a unique opportunity to start this process. And so, speaking of opportunity, let's start with the inception and opportunity. Right, so just a little bit of background history. 2015, Trigger, a mixed reality agency, approached Wētā Workshop to create an original IP to theme their AR board game concept called Giant Killer Robots. So the challenge was Trigger did not have a game design at that stage, and they'd never made an AR board game. Wētā Workshop had never made a board game either. Both of our companies had done a lot of service work before and done a lot of really good service work. But I felt like in this instance, both companies were sort of definitely going out on a bit more of a limb to do something a bit different. So the opportunity was that we had a chance to actually create an IP that could drive game development rather than just skin it. So typically in board games, and I've been in the board game industry now for about 5 or 6 years on the side, I can sort of say that in my experience, usually with board games, the game gets created and finished as a piece of game design, and then typically is sort of skinned and themed, which is an interesting and pretty standard process. However, after going through the process on GKR, I've come to realise how much more engaging and interesting it can be, where the world can in fact drive gameplay and feed into gameplay, and vice versa. Gameplay can actually feed back and drive ideas around the world and IP. And so this was a really interesting sort of back and forth process, and it's a big part of what I think made GKR special. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So the first sort of thing I want to touch on is that it's a noisy world out there. We launched this game in, I think the Kickstarter was 2017. The game was delivered after a few bumps in 2018. And so, but even, just 2 or 3 years ago, it was, nothing has changed. It's an incredibly noisy world out there. You're competing against so many other products and so many other amazing worlds and concepts. So something you have to consider very early on is how are you going to come up with something that's going to stand out? And there's no easy answer to that other than just a lot of hard work and a lot of clever thinking, I think. But the main thing is you just need to be aware of it, because it does very much inform your decision making around how you position your IP and how you might try to enter into the market, and then more importantly, how do you grab people's attention. So perhaps just a little bit of context on the three of us as creators. We were all senior concept artists working in the design studio at Wētā Workshop, and also art directors as well. And obviously we've had a very fortunate career, having dealt with a number of really amazing directors and worked on a lot of fairly high-profile films. And it goes without saying that you learn a tremendous amount from that experience. And that was experience that we very much drew upon when starting this creative development opportunity with GKR. And it wasn't the only job we were doing. It was very much a job that we were building around all of our service work. And it was not a bad thing at all to treat it like, in some ways, a normal job. Just with the added advantage that for the first time we were in a position to be calling the creative shots rather than potentially serving someone else's vision. The other thing that the three of us had, I guess as well, outside of work, was that we all were very busy doing other things that weren't just film. And we'd done quite a few different things, in some instances taking products to market, which I think was a big part of perhaps why we were able to jump on this particular opportunity, because we had some proven track record over taking something to market. Larry had been involved with creating a video game called Neo Tokyo. I produced a series of books called White Cloud Worlds. And Christian has spent his whole life constantly producing and making stuff and bringing it into the world. And so there was certainly an aspect of those experiences that also fed into our development of GKR. So I guess the takeaway there is if you are going to create an IP, there's some real benefits to doing it as a team, a small team, and with a team that has complementary skill sets. And so that was one of the other big things with us, is that we could all kind of work across each other's work quite equally, though we did definitely have our specialties as well. Right. Okay, so where things kind of start for us is usually what I call the art of ideation, which is really just a fancy word for brainstorming. So, when you talk to people about creating IP and products, they'll often talk a lot about market research, and, if it's a game, then they'll talk about how art and design needs to support gameplay, and, audience experience is really important. And you know what? All of those things are really important. And, I've done previous talks on why they're important. But the elephant in the room is that that's actually not where we start. That's not where me and Christian and Larry started. And it's typically not where we start any project. Though that's not to say that we don't think about those things later, but we don't usually start with them. Where we do start is usually the idea. And that usually involves us, in this instance, it was locking ourselves in a room for 5 days to define our creative vision, high concept, story, character, and world. We weren't trying to solve everything in those 5 days, but given the busyness of the industry that we're in, the fact that we would be across multiple projects, we kind of realized that in order to try to give ourselves the best chance of coming up with a really good idea, we really did just need to lock ourselves in a room for a few days. We needed our colleagues and our work to leave us alone for a few days, and that's exactly what they did. We kind of took over the library in the studio, and we were in there from early in the morning till sort of late at night for 5 days. That was the challenge, 5 days to come up with something. And we were pretty confident that we would get something in 5 days. I mean, we're used to turning around ideas very quickly for clients. So this seemed like a little bit of a luxury. Turned out that it was actually really hard work and kind of a little scary. But the great thing was, at the end of those 5 days, we did come up with the core idea. And for us, that's the important thing, because if the core idea is really solid, then a lot of those other things that we were just referencing, like audience experience and, point of difference and market research, a lot of those things will flow naturally from a good idea. What we try not to do when we start this kind of like ideation phase is we never give any consideration to budget and limitations, which probably scares a lot of people for me saying that, but it's true. We try to think big, and we don't let our ideas be restrained in any way. What we focus on more is just seeing how far we can push that idea, and then letting it settle back, and then we start applying the reality check to it. So part of that process is, and going into that room, as it were, you kind of want to know a few key things. You want to know the why, and you want to know why you are creating and what you stand for. I call it planting a flag, and the MTV reference is actually pretty apt here, because as you'll see going through the development of this IP, there was a certain period of entertainment that we'll dip into a lot for inspiration, and MTV was definitely one of those inspirational things that we grew up with, and we definitely tapped into. So the why for us is pretty straightforward, actually. It's not particularly complicated. The reason we get out of bed in the morning and do what we do is because we love to create. We love, and more specifically, we love to create imaginary worlds that we can tell amazing stories in with really great characters, or at least be a part of that process with someone else's project. So we kind of knew why we do what we do. The what is a little bit more complex. I think sometimes we often end up working on projects where it might be a really fun project, but we may feel that there isn't a great deal of meaning behind it. And I think for the three of us, we do, and I think a lot of people at Wētā actually prescribe a lot of meaning to what we do. We don't want to just entertain people, but we also want to shape those people in a positive and meaningful way, which often means that the project you're working on, you want to sort of invest it with something meaningful, something that maybe there's a message there or an important theme, or you might be just wanting to explore some interesting ideas. And in all fairness, a lot of the films that we've worked on have those things in spades. And so, again, we feel very lucky in that respect. So, where do you start? And I think because it was just the three of us, we kind of had to look at each other in the room and go, well, what, because it's a blank canvas. Like, we literally could have just about started anywhere. The only thing that Trigger was asking for us was that could we try to work in robots somehow, but that was it. It was a blank canvas. And so we've seen a lot of, over the years, working on a lot of projects, we've seen how difficult it can be sometimes when you have people that are not on the same page, moving a project forward. And so part of the nice thing about the three of us was that we'd worked in the trenches together on a lot of really hard projects for a lot of the time. And so we kind of knew that we could work together really well. We weren't precious around each other's work, and we could be very honest with each other in a really trusting kind of way. But ultimately, you want to still rally around something so that you can all contribute kind of equally and be excited equally. And so what that meant was we kind of had to sit down and work out what we all liked. And I mean, we knew what we liked at some level because we spent years talking about cool stuff. But it was another thing to actually kind of really sift it down to something that we could kind of work into what was going to become a board game, an AR board game at that stage. But more pertinently, something that we could take much further as an IP. And so we looked at what inspires us. And so a big part of that is what inspires you growing up as a kid. We grew up predominantly in the 80s, certainly influenced by some 90s stuff as well. But one thing that we all knew, and this is just a small selection of stuff that we kind of really boiled down really quickly on that first day was, what's the stuff that floats our boat, and how can we kind of take inspiration from that and to create something new? And so what it boiled down to was comics, particularly sci-fi, and comics and movies that have a sci-fi theme, that are subversive, satirical. Humor was a huge part for us, actually. We really wanted to try to create something funny as best we could. But it has a social message, or at least some kind of social commentary. And so Akira obviously has all of those things. I grew up on a series, Christian was a huge Akira fan, so was Larry. I wasn't that familiar with Akira. I was much more familiar with 2000 AD, which is a British comic book series. Judge Dredd being the most obvious character from that series, but there was a whole bunch of long ongoing stories with different characters and different worlds that had similar kind of exploration. And in films like Paul Verhoeven's RoboCop and Starship Troopers. And so effectively what we did is we kind of boiled down the kind of area that we wanted to start to think in. And this is kind of where we got to with that. Next, we sort of took it a step further. Okay, and so we started thinking about the style of world that we wanted to set it in and some of the themes. And this is the big thing here is themes. Christian is a huge sports fan. We all play sport, the three of us, but to be honest, I think Christian's probably the most avid sport fan, in particular Formula One racing and sport that has a strong technological aspect to it. So that was something that he was really interested in exploring, especially considering we were doing a game and we were already starting to think about robots and involved in some kind of game. We all had a mutual dislike of reality TV and what we felt that was doing to the industry, the entertainment industry. And so we kind of thought, but at the same time, we were kind of fascinated by it, kind of celebrity culture as well. And so we kind of thought that was really interesting to us as well. How could we perhaps dip into that world? And finally, corporations. I think Larry and Christian had done a huge amount of work on Neil Blomkamp's films, looking at how building fake corporations and sort of building corporate iconography into films. And so this was their real wheelhouse, I think, in many respects. And so it felt like a natural extension to continue to want to explore that. And we're happy consumers. We grew up in a very consumer-driven culture, but at the same time, that doesn't mean we don't question consumerism and corporate mega corporates and what their intentions are. It's not that we have a particular agenda. We're just potentially interested in exploring those themes in our world. The one thing that we were pretty keen on from the get-go, which was important to us, was that we wanted to avoid a military game. Weirdly enough, we spent so much of our design lives designing weapons and armor, but they're always been for imaginary worlds. We're actually pretty pacifist. We don't really like real war in any shape or form. We didn't want to glorify war in any way either for this product. So we actually kind of were starting to think, well, we want to have the trappings of military cool and military technology, but we wanted to do something different with it. We didn't want it to be a warfare game. Right, so the next step was to start to take some of these ideas and work up some world story and even character ideas. It was what we typically would do is we would meet in the library, we would brainstorm, write stuff up on the blackboard, but more often than not, we'd actually go back to our desks or somewhere quiet and just do a bit of writing. Or in some cases, Christian would do what I'm showing you right now, which is he would just often grab a piece of found imagery or smash out a little bit of photo bashing and just write something that sounds interesting or is advancing the cause of what we think our sort of background story is. And because the three of us were concept artists predominantly and not full-time writers, we definitely had writing as a component to what we were doing, but we were sort of limiting ourselves to just writing 1 or 2 pages of ideas. We would then very quickly shift those ideas into a visual format, like these examples of Christians, to then discuss in a more visual way. And this was something that we've done a lot with other clients. For us, it's a very good way of finding out whether we're on the right track, because we're very visual people and we want to sort of test that concept quickly. And so the idea here is fail fast, learn faster. And so that's where not spending a lot of time doing expensive, elaborate concept designs. A lot of this can just be done with found imagery or adapting found imagery quickly to get it a little bit more in tone, and then combining that with some relevant sort of short, pithy text. And the goal here was in some ways was to try to find the timeline for our world and the setting, because that was for us. That's as a world builders, we tend to start that way often, rather than a screenwriter perhaps would start with the protagonist and write a story around that. We're actually taking a step back from that and actually wanting to look at what the world history was. Okay, at some point you definitely need to start to boil it down, and this gets kind of tricky. And it took us a long time to get it to something this sort of short. But it's kind of, you might hear of it being the elevator pitch. But effectively, this is kind of our core concept that we came out with, which was that it's the near future is here, and Earth's abandoned cities have been turned into battlegrounds for the ultimate spectator sport, giant killer robots. So this is taking those sort of 3 themes, which is kind of corporate culture, celebrity culture and reality TV, and science fiction, and sort of merging them all into one concept. And so I think it's really important to thrash this. It's kind of like, one sentence or at least one paragraph sort of statement around your core idea. Because you know what? If you can't get it down in a line or two, you don't have an idea. You've just still got an idea that's still intangible at some level, because you're incapable of writing it down and getting it locked. And so this is where you kind of really have to really work hard to boil it down to that kind of succinct idea. Guillermo del Toro, when we worked with him, he would often call it a singular conceit. And I think that's something I've always remembered. And I think that's what we were trying to achieve here. Now, that doesn't mean that that singular conceit is not going to evolve or change and develop. In fact, you kind of hope it will. But it just means that where you're starting from, your foundation, your IP foundational level, has got a really good idea with substance. It's not just smoke and mirrors. And I think that's the key takeaway we want to sort of encourage you to think about there. The other thing we did during that week is we knew that robots were cool and giant killer robots sounded great in some ways, though the killer part sounded a bit scary. So we were trying to think of ways where we could kind of diffuse that aspect a wee bit, and that's where the sport concept came in. But the idea that the robots evolved out of a military complex and then it turned into sport, and hence the giant killer robots. But what we were really interested in was telling human stories. And so we wanted to get, and that made us realize pretty early on that we needed to think about humans, characters, and in this instance, we figured pilots. We'd grown up on Evangelion and tons of amazing anime, and so there was already kind of in our heads the idea that, well, why don't we perhaps put pilots inside these robots, a bit like Formula One cars, so that we've now got a human story to tell. And because we were sort of thinking in terms of 4, because we thought it was probably going to be a 4-player game, we thought we needed a minimum of 4 characters. So the first thing we did, being not professional writers, is we tried to approach a different way, and we started thinking about dynamics, 4-person dynamics that we had grown up with in shows that we liked. Not necessarily like now, but it liked at the time. And so what we're looking for here is kind of like the formula, because a lot of these 4-people dynamics, there's a real formula to it. There's often the kind of leader, then there's the kind of jokey character, there might be the love interest character, and so on and so on. Or it might be like there's this intellectual character, there's the physical character, there's the naive character, there's the sensei style character. The important thing is that you're kind of looking for these tropes and archetypical roles, but what you're really looking for is the dynamic, because that's what you're wanting to create interest and tension through those character interactions, which means they need to have a dynamic. They need to, at some level, there needs to be a sense of natural alliance and also the opposite with these characters and how that can shift and change. The other big thing, so for us, Seinfeld was huge growing up for us, massive. And it's fair to say we're obsessive compulsive fans of Ghostbusters and comics. Fantastic Four I was not so into, but it's an interesting dynamic. I love Scooby-Doo, and the A-Team was always pretty good fun. And so I think part of what we're also looking for there is just interesting ideas around even like the way the characters, particularly with Seinfeld, the way the characters portrayed physically and psychologically, because they all have these quirks, right? And so that's something that's rich, fertile ground for a designer. So what we're trying to actually look for is quirks and interesting attitudes. But you need to be critical of this kind of formula and these kind of shows. I mean, these are all shows and properties that are pretty old now, and they don't necessarily tune well to the contemporary audience. And so, going into this, we knew that there were things that we didn't want to embrace around this, especially being 3 middle-aged white guys, right? We were pretty interested in making sure that at least our pilots were going to be a lot more diverse and interesting than some of the shows that we watched growing up as kids. So whiteboards are a huge part of our process, and also a thing called we call it the wall. It's basically a huge wall that we throw work up on. We don't generally review work on a single screen. The reason for that is that you can't step back and look at a collective body of work holistically and look for patterns and themes and how one design or idea might contrast with another. It's very old school, but it just can't be beat in my opinion. There's something very tactile about it. and we use it to this very day. And so I can't stress big enough that it's so important to get stuff up on the wall. And this is just from those formulas that we looked at. This is just one whiteboard that we worked up, where we were trying to work through the 4 characters around kind of like their core traits and their core emotional states, physicality, gender, ethnicity, background. We were just trying to throw a whole bunch of ideas down, but what we're trying to create is ally and conflict, and try to work out how they would kind of work together. It was a super fun process. We didn't just do this at a written level. We started doing this also at a more visual level, but I'll just show you what we did as a next step. Being the video gamers that we are, we couldn't help ourselves. We started immediately assigning stats to them, which kind of made sense too, because we are sort of, at the end of the day, we are making a board game as well. We had no idea what that game design was going to be, but we didn't even think that the pilots would necessarily be playing a big part of the gameplay. But it just helped us take that information and put it into a form that made more sense to us, but even better, we could explain it to other people, because sometimes the easiest way to test an idea is to just get someone who has no idea about what you're working on into the room and then try to explain it to them. And that's the amazing thing with working at the design studio at Wētā. We've got a whole room full of very talented, smart designers, and it's just a matter of 2 seconds to go grab a bunch of them, pull them into a room, and kind of pitch them what you're thinking. And a diagram like this helps visualize that process. It gives them a chance to get up to speed quickly and to try to get what we're getting at. And if they're not getting it, well, then we need to go back to the drawing board. It also helped us work out just simple things like we need to be thinking about color. That's definitely something we need to be thinking about, is color as a way of differentiating characters and potentially even robotic factions. Okay. The other thing we needed to think about was how we were going to position ourselves to be different from other properties. That doesn't necessarily mean that we were trying to become the most original new thing out there. That's really hard to do, but what you are at least striving to do is have an original take on an idea. And so, Trigger had come to us very much based off of their love of District 9 and some of Neil Blomkamp's other films. And certainly Larry and Christian were very well known for their gritty, real design work. And so is Wētā, actually. We're kind of known for that kind of gritty, real, grounded approach. And so, that's the Moose from Chappie, and that's Greg Broadmoor's design from District 9 for the mech. Very, very grounded, very serious. We want to do something a little bit more lighthearted with this property, and that we thought and this is where we thought there was an opening for us, because when you look at a lot of the more colourful, brighter robots, you very quickly sort of into that kind of more anime or Transformers zone, which is, drifting out of that more gritty, grounded space. And so we kind of wanted to kind of take an approach where we took a very grounded approach to the design, but infused it with all of that amazing ingenuity and color and life that you sometimes get in some of those Japanese animes and mangas that, we loved so much. And so that was kind of how we started thinking about positioning ourselves in terms of the robots. Right. So early on, while we were, starting to produce some of this content, we didn't have a game, but we realized that in order for our IP and the game to try to be successful, well, you have to start to try to build an audience. And certainly Ike was doing a lot of research for us at this stage into board games. I mean, I out of the 3 of us, I was the one that played board games the most. The other 2, Larry and Christian, were huge video game players, but I was the board gamer. And we were acutely aware that we didn't know enough about the board game industry. We knew plenty about the film industry. And so all of us started to try to do a bit of a deep dive on it, but particularly me, and Ike was amazing at starting to do a lot of research work for us, because this is, if you want to produce a successful product, you do need to start to learn about that. And that's where market research comes into play. And the great thing with Ike is that not only was he learning a lot about board games and Kickstarters for us, but he has a great eye for understanding where the gaps might be in terms of market positioning. And he also knows, and because he's known Christian forever, and he's known me and Larry for a good amount of time as well, is he kind of knows what we were trying to achieve with GKR, and he was very much a process of developing that as well. And so he came up with the idea of, why don't we do a thing called GKR TV, which was the making of, because we're so used to doing behind the scenes for films, the making of the board game as a way of taking people on the journey with us and getting them invested in what we were doing, so that by the time we launched the game, we might have an audience that really wanted to help us out and want the game. It was a really great idea. I think fair to say, it scared the pants off the company, because what he was pitching and what Larry and Christian and myself were into was pretty out there. And he put together the sizzle reel, which I'm going to show you, which we'll stop and watch right now, and then we'll have a quick chat about it.
If you want to advertise propaganda side of trading, and this warning is closer. I mean, I think this is the business. It's not faith on this. What's the radio presents contracts in any number of ways.
Okay, so this is a reel. Yeah, so I put that together basically with found content for the most part, but pretty much what came out of that sizzle reel was, A, the company was not convinced that this was a good idea, but they were willing to humour us for a while. But B, and this was the most awesome thing that came out of it, was that somehow he managed to channel the tone of the world we were building. And more importantly, started to unlock a way that we could communicate with an audience in this tone. And so even though GKR TV didn't actually go anywhere, probably for the best, to be honest, what it did give us was the opportunity to learn and find our voice, I guess, for how we wanted to talk to our audience. Right, the next step, getting real, or as we like to call it, fake it till you make it. Okay, so the idea with this is that it's a pretty simple concept. The quicker you make something appear real, we find the easier it is to make a decision around whether it's the right course to follow or not. And so a big part of what you're going to see in the next sort of few slides is what we're effectively doing is trying to make it real. We're trying to put our design work into context in a way, and often in a very quick and dirty way, but in a way that does test the waters as to whether what we're doing works. Because we've found that over years of designing, that one of the dangers is that you design stuff and then when you actually put it into context, it doesn't work. And so we really wanted to avoid that particular pitfall. And for us, that process actually starts with the identity. We needed a name, at least a placeholder name. We now had the tone, and we had a bunch of ideas, but what we needed to do was start to channel some of that into an identity. Weirdly enough, a lot of products leave their identity development, like the logo, to the very end, or at least halfway through. We often start there. And Larry is particularly a bit of a guru at this kind of stuff. And so Larry and Christian actually both started to work on the identity for GKR. At this stage of the game, I was spending a lot of time with Ike learning about board games and starting to liaise. I guess I was a little bit more of a producer at this stage of the game, along with helping with the creative development. But this is where Larry and Christian really started to fire up on the design side of things. And you'll see that to the right, top right, is an example of making it real. This is Larry taking some of his logos and putting them into a context to see how they vibe and feel. Sometimes we even fake a pitch, like we do like a fake pitch page, to sort of see if it communicates at a pitch level to know that it's on the right vibe. So what you're trying to avoid here is an identity crisis. You're trying to find an identity that fits the property and the tone, most importantly, that you're creating for your property, that you can rally around, and that drives, you constantly come back to it too. It's like when you design something, you go back to that identity and you go, does that fit? Because if it doesn't, you probably need to keep designing. Similar process for the factions. We knew enough now from working on the game side of things that we were going to have factions of robots. And so Christian immediately went into robot design mode and started penciling up a whole bunch of designs. Larry, on the graphic design side of things, immediately started coming up with a bunch of corporate logos that would define. And so the goal here was to define those factions. We wanted to define them through corporate identity because, remember, we're doing a big thing on corporate consumer themes. We want to have a lot of fun with that, like the craziness of their corporations, the back history of the corporations. And we also wanted to make sure that the shape language for each one of those robot families was distinct and that they were going to be assigned a very strong color denoter as well. And one of the things that, again, we do all the time, which not every designer does, but I would certainly encourage it, particularly when you're in the development space, is write and design as you go. A lot of the time when you're designing, you have great ideas. Like you're thinking about what you're designing. Write it down. It's really common for us to accompany design with a bit of written text. And the reason for that is that over the years of working with clients is that we usually don't have direct access. We're sending work in a package. And so you're not there to explain it. And so we really quickly realized that you need to, sometimes your design just doesn't explain well enough. Or it may not stop them enough to slow them down enough to take it in. And so putting a bit of text with it often we're kind of pre-programmed to read at some level. As long as you don't write too much, sometimes you'll have a director stop and read. And then when they read, sometimes I've had instances where they don't like my design, but they love the idea. And so I'll get another shot at it. That's taught us the value of designing and writing at the same time and packaging those two together. And so this is very much what Larry was doing, is that as he was working up these logos, he was actually starting to write background text for these factions. Like when he was working out the concept for Thunder Happy or King Wolf Incorporated, he would start to write a little bit of background text. Okay, still on the theme of making it real, you definitely want to road test your designs in context. This was a pivotal piece for the project for us. Again, Larry was all over this one, taking Christian's design of kind of King Wolf and in this case Thunder Happy down there as well, and then trying to incorporate all of the elements that we were playing with, which was graphic design, environmental setting, our themes of corporate advertising, of military style sports robots, and this kind of striking sort of graphic kind of intent. Now, at this stage, Larry's obviously sort of steering down the live action route a little bit. That's the space we're used to working in. And we didn't really know whether the style of the illustrations for the game might go very realistic. But the most important thing is that this was one of the first times that all of those different elements and ideas came together and designs came together in a single image. And it was that image that we now knew we were on the right track. Everything was starting to gel. There was a long way to go. Everything was starting to gel. The one thing that quickly evolved from this was that we needed to get those robots in colour and shift them out of the kind of black and white, because again, that started to feel too post-apocalyptic and grim versus post-apocalyptic and kind of utopian. We were playing with more of a utopian consumer society, but we wanted to take the piss out of that as well. Buying into your own designs, this is another exercise we do a lot, especially when you know that you're going to be creating a product that's going to be made into products. It's another way of road testing your designs. Take those logos, take those graphic elements, take that illustration and put it onto a product. Would you buy that product? If you wouldn't buy that product, then either you're not the right target market, and in this case, we were making an IP that was us. We were the target market. So if those designs weren't working on stuff that we want to own and buy, then that design's not right. We need to rethink what we're doing from a design perspective or even an IP perspective. The great news was, again, putting this stuff onto fake merchandising reinforced that we were on the right direction. And weirdly enough, some of it did actually go straight through and get made into products, which just goes to show that if you kind of lay the foundation right, a lot of the stuff sticks right the way through to the very end. So this is just another good example. It's called 360. The 360. It's the idea of, for an IP where you're doing a full 360 IP, where you're looking at all of the different applications for the IP, whether it's consumer products, maybe entertainment, publishing, and so on. So you're effectively faking products for all of those outcomes and seeing how it all works together. Holistically is the key word there. Finding your crash test dummy. So in the process of road testing these and making it real, you'll often, if you're lucky, find your crash test dummy. Your crash test dummy is basically the thing that you keep, which you kind of use to lead your exploration of IP and design endeavor. So in this case, King Wolf, which was, I think, probably one of the first robots Christian designed, was the one that we all got the most excited about the quickest. That was King Wolf was our crash test dummy. That was the design and the character or the faction that we always led most of our design exploration and IP exploration with. And then really all we did was spill those ideas and concepts and wins across the other factions and across the rest of the IP. And the great thing about doing that is you get this very consistent evolutionary growth. But at any time, you can look backwards and go, oh yeah, actually we've gone off the track. We need to go back to where we were. Or you can validate the fact that you've got this evolutionary growth. And here's a good example of that, starting with the pencil drawing. Then Larry's kind of in-world context, live action piece. The breakthrough piece for us next was actually the black and white comic book style piece, because this is where we were needing to start to resolve a consistent illustrative style for the IP. We loved comics. We loved the idea of doing comics for the IP, and we felt that this was possibly the best way of starting to explore the world, was through maybe not doing a comic because we didn't necessarily have the budget, or maybe we did, but at this stage we didn't, but faking a comic could be kind of fun. And so taking a big page out of Akira, Christian was in his own style, actually, in all honesty. A lot of this was driven by Christian's aesthetic, which he's been working on for a very, very long time. He started working out some of these ideas. And that piece for us was pivotal, because then we realised once again, yep, this is the style that we want to run with for the IP. And you can see the top middle is his next evolutionary step, where we took that idea into a world setting, started bringing in some of the corporate iconography that Larry is working up. And then you can see the next evolutionary step in that, which actually turned into an animation test, which we'll talk about later. And then finally how that actually led right through to the box cover for the product. So that's your crash test dummy. Okay. Story. This is our, kind of for us, this is where, even though, like I said, we're not professional writers, and we're very aware of how important writing a story is in the process of creating an IP, but because we were doing an IP arguably through a consumer product first, we felt that we could at least get enough story down to at least deliver and explore the world before we leapt into writing scripts, which might involve hiring another writer, or it just means we take dedicated time to try write the scripts ourselves. So it's kind of like a really fun sandbox to play in where you're developing an IP through a product. You get to try a bunch of things. Even more importantly, you get a chance to try out whether the market likes it. But what you don't have to necessarily do in this case was really lock to a protagonist or a particular linear story. So for us, that felt like a really fun place to be in, versus like spending months honing a script. But story is very important. So we immediately went to comics because we love comics and because we kind of felt, in fact, Christian had done his own comic before, plenty of them. And I'd been involved with colouring comics on the Red Star. And so we all kind of felt that this was a great place to start exploring story, was through comics, because it solves the visualization of that world at the same time. We also knew that we needed to start getting people interested in this game and this world, but we didn't have a game. So we thought, well, if we're going to somewhere like Comic-Con, maybe we give away a free copy of this comic. And so we did a 16-page, I think it was, comic that helped us explore the story of the world. I wrote the script based off of the world setting that we've been coming up with. I did a lot of the character drawing, Christian doing the robots, and then both of us rendering it up with help from Larry. And it was a super, super fun process. And the other super important thing about this was that me, Larry, and Christian have very, very different artistic styles. There's probably a little bit more of a similar merge between Larry and Christian, but we're all very different. And when you're creating an IP that you want consistency in, and also we were creating an IP for Wētā Workshop, which means that other people need to be able to join that IP and be able to contribute to it and have a consistent style. So what we started trying to develop with this comic was a unified style that takes the best of what all three of us have to offer, but can ultimately potentially become a pipeline that gets a very consistent result, even if the three of us are no longer working as artists on the property. And a big part of that process was 3D. But I'm going to go into that in more detail. But this was very much us trying to solve that problem for the first time, along with the story. Just a quick note on what we call the art of the reuse. If you're clever when you set your IP up and you do enough thinking ahead, when you create assets or the way you set up pipelines, you can, if you're clever, you can reuse those assets again and again and again and again. And for us, the comic was that. The assets that we used to build the comic, we used some 3D assets to build the comic, laid the way for the 3D pipeline for creating the miniatures for the game, and so on. So, but a lot of the imagery we reused again and again and again. And the other great thing about this too is it unifies the IP from a visual perspective as well. But this is the trick. Think about how you might want to reuse content in the future. How do you take an image that was once a comic book panel and now become a piece of advertising or the cover for a pitch document? And this is the trick. You need to be wanting to think about how you can be clever around reusing content. Okay, the comic. So this is just a few spreads from it. Again, probably this is where we started trying to solve how to integrate the pilots into the story. Like, how do we get human story into robots fighting? And so this was, and the banter going between the pilots. So this was a good attempt for us to get that in. How do we get the media, the social media commentary angle going in? And more importantly, how did these robots start looking how do these robots start looking in these ruined, abandoned cities on Earth now? Because what's happened is the humanity has come back from the brink of an apocalypse and has now built these kind of utopian cities. But there's these old cities lying around. And so the core concept we came up with was, well, they're just a massive they're a massive resource that's already, they're just steel and iron and all of this raw resources just sitting there. Why don't we turn the sport into a massive salvage party? It's a demolition party, basically. The sport is you go into the city and you demolish you're fighting for salvage rights. You're demolishing the city as sport, and then the winner gets the salvage rights to take all of that raw material to build these newer, better cities, rather than carving up the earth to create, big mines for raw resources. So there's a little bit of a kind of environmental theme going on there. But we thought it was a really interesting spin, was this idea of recycling cities for sport. And so that middle image, which we worked up, was pivotal, because for the first time we now started to try to work out how we wanted to portray these sort of alternate earth ancient cities, and how that might be something we can work into the game at a more stylistic level. This is a concept that Larry calls direct transmission, and I think we'd all sort of thought a lot about it, but he's the one that kind of really coined it and explained it really well. I'm probably going to sort of botch it a bit, but I'm going to give it a go. For the idea of direct transmission is that what you're trying to do is come up with a singular image that says everything you want to say about your property. Like the promise, what I call the promise of the premise. This idea is that if your property is called Giant Killer Robots and it's about, excitement and dynamic energy, and it's engaging, and there's kind of a comic book aesthetic to it, but it's not a comic book, and so on and so on, can you come up with an image or a series of images that just through the nature of being an image directly transmit some of that emotional content and sort of tone of what you're trying to achieve directly into the audience? And the more direct you can make that, the more effective it is. And one of the reasons why this is an important concept and why it takes time to find those images that speak directly to your product and what you're trying to achieve creatively and philosophically and thematically and tonally, is that idea of how do you cut through the noise. There is just so much noise to cut through in the entertainment space. And so the more effective your imagery is at cutting through the noise and directly embedding in the brain of your audience, the better. And so, this is why finding one of those images that just speaks to you as something that really speaks to you as the heart and soul of your product, and then you use that image and you tend to reuse it a lot, or you try to refine it in a way that does an even better job, and then more importantly you test it at things like conventions and online to see whether it's getting traction. But what you're looking for is direct transmission. So that's just something to keep in mind as well. So along the way, when you're starting to make stuff real, you get some really awesome happy accidents, and we're all about the happy accidents. We try to never be too prescriptive in our process. We're always looking for that unexpected thing that you stumble across. When we were doing the comic, Larry, we needed to do a space filler for the final page, and Larry, being a cola fan, we'll say, decided that he would come up with his own cola, and called Hapsy, and do a full, fill up the space with this ad called Hapsy. And for some weird reason, we just kind of loved Hapsy, and it kind of just grew from there to the point where we actually I think, might have even grabbed Hapsy as a trademark. We certainly got the .com. And we even thought about how fun it would be to create Hapsy Cola for real. This is the kind of crazy tangential thinking that you start going down on projects like this. It's so much fun. But what you do kind of need to do is tie it back to something that's kind of useful. What we found in Hapsy, just through fun more than anything, was he was a character that we could actually use in a subversive and viral way to promote our product through in-world. And this was huge for us. And when it came to marketing and talking to our audience and fans, was we decided to make an effort to stay in-world. We love the idea of taking the piss out of, corporations and how they advertise. And we love the idea of having fun with that and sort of seeing how far we could go with it. Just like those crazy ads in Starship Troopers, or RoboCop. This was the kind of stuff we were sort of riffing off. And Hapsy was the forerunner. Hapsy was our crash test dummy for that process. There were a bunch of others that followed, but he was the lead. Okay, so that's just something about happy accidents. So I think this is the final slide on this little section of story, is don't forget your story as a creator and as a team. We were just so incredibly fortunate with the people that we had to work with on this. It was often, we had a very tight budget, and as always, we had a lot of people just willing to pitch in and give us a lot of help and support, just because they believed in what we were trying to achieve. And that wasn't just people at our own workshop, that was people at Cryptozoic and people at Trigger, and just actually a lot of people we met in the industry along the way. One of the things I will say about the board game community is they are one of the most sharing and caring communities I've ever come across, in terms of sharing what they know in a very unreserved and unfiltered way. And it was really, for people that were new to the industry like us at Wētā, it was an incredibly humbling experience. And so for us, it made us realize, especially considering we're from the film industry, we do a lot of behind the scenes work for film, we started to want to make sure that we celebrated our story as creators. And we always, and this is a big thing about Wētā, we always try to position creativity first, and sort of the consumer product second. We always lead with the creative as much as possible. That doesn't mean that making money isn't important, because it is. It keeps us in jobs. It actually keeps the lights on. But we always try to lead with creative first, and the creative story. And so that was something I want you to think about when you're creating your own IP, is don't neglect your own story, because people might have a real interest in that and want to help you, or at least follow you and become sympathetic to what you're trying to achieve, which again helps with that idea of cutting through the noise, because the more people that join you on your journey and support you, hopefully the more that will grow and in turn cut through the noise. But more importantly, it's just fun, and it's collaborative, which is what we're all about. Okay, character. So, as you can imagine, Giant Killer Robots, the board game and the IP, we were going to be doing a lot of work on robots, and particularly Christian Pierce, who kind of led the charge on the design work, with the exception of Hammerstrike, which that faction was designed by Larry. So there were a number of challenges around the design of the robots. A big part of it was initially we had no gameplay, so it was kind of cool actually. It was a very open brief. But at the same time, we still had some manufacturing challenges. We knew that we wanted to produce these really large, amazing robot game pieces. Luckily, Wētā has a lot of experience in consumer products. We've been doing collectibles for years and years. And so we were able to start to resolve some of those challenges early on. Having said that, Christian really did push the envelope and to try to create some designs that were really challenging to actually get to work from a manufacturing perspective. But and so the other thing that we were working on behind the scenes was kind of getting our universal laws and world logic down in relationship to these robot characters. And the main reason, again, is casting to sort of future-proofing, was that we kind of knew there needed to be some kind of combat ecosystem for the game. But if we ever did try to make a film or a TV series, we needed to make sure that whatever we came up for the game would actually potentially work in a dramatic and cool way for a different medium. And so this is, a common thing we do for a lot of projects, is we try to think out what are the kind of, core world logic for our IP, for our world and for the characters that inhabit that world. And so this is just an example of, it was just a diagram that Christian worked up to try to explain that combat ecology, which we were sharing with Trigger at the time, because they would then be taking these concepts and starting to do some AR tests. The AR part of it was challenging. really exciting because not many board games at that time were using AR, and Trigger was obviously super interested in bringing all of their expertise to this area. And some of the tests that they did were so cool and so exciting. Literally watching your robot play piece fire rockets and stuff. It was pretty amazing. And we were pretty excited about the whole approach, but there were some challenges around the design aspect of it. How do you get, the models needed to be low poly. They had to be able to be read by the AR technology, which meant that there were some big challenges around how you actually design to that. The other problem was that once we started playtesting the AR with board gamers, we actually learned that they were kind of quite lukewarm on the whole AR kind of component. They really enjoyed the physical board game, but were less interested in the AR part of it. And I guess that's what the message we got there was, that people want to play board games for social interaction, and bringing a device up in front of you kind of gets in the way of that a bit. And so the hard decision was made to actually lose the augmented reality part, and for at least this first version of the game, and double down on what was a really good board game that was coming together, which Cryptozoic was, which was leading the charge on with Matt Hyra. So sometimes you just don't always hit your target, but you've got to kind of take the wins that you can from those kind of adventures and carry on. So embrace limitations. And so we had the manufacturing limitations around what we could do. We also had the limitations based around it early on, the AR. And that did give us a really interesting signature look for the robots. These kind of unique black and white decals were what the technology was reading, and it gave the characters a really interesting, the robots a really interesting look. It was so cool that we even started sort of spilling that aesthetic at a graphic design level into other components as well. The other really important note here is, I mean, if you're a designer, you'll be very familiar with the idea of hierarchy of communication. But I think we didn't appreciate just how much we needed to embrace that until we started doing the game design aspect of it, working with Cryptozoic, and starting to get down to the nitty gritty of having to explain the combat ecology of these characters and how they relate to the gameplay through gameplay componentry like the cards. And so the win for us there was that a lot of what we learned through that process of playtesting the game componentry is we actually also worked out how that graphic design could translate into marketing materials to better sell the product itself at a really clear way. This is just an example of how detailed some of these models got. The models themselves for the games were very high detailed, but we actually went even more detailed than was required because, again, thinking to the future, we love the idea of delivering on the premise of giant killer robots, which what we tend to do as a company is when we go to Comic-Con, we usually bring these really large display pieces to, have a lot of fun with that, get fans excited. And we love the idea of doing a massive King Wolf. And so we started doing a much more high-res version of the heavy hitter models for the purpose of potentially letting us build these really detailed, larger models. We did a smaller version for some dioramas as well. But another key reason we thought about doing this was because we also thought it would be really cool to maybe explore a consumer products avenue where we do model kits. So again, we're thinking outside the scope of just the game we were making. We were always thinking of how we could exploit the IP into other areas and have fun there. Right, so these are the finished 3D model renders for each of the factions and their combat support ecology. And on the left-hand side is actually one of our hero masters, physical masters. This was 3D prototyped and modeled by our amazing manufacture team, fabrication team, and then the paint department doing an insane paint job on it. And this was one of the hero King Wolves, I think probably about 30 centimeters high. that went into one of our dioramas, which we took around shows. Right, our human characters. So pretty common practice in terms of character development. It's once we had that kind of matrix down of our 4 characters and their personality types and characteristics and maybe the role they were going to play, we started to, one of the first things we do is sort of cast around it those kind of iconics and other shows to get some sense of how they made those characters successful. We're not trying to copy those characters, but we are looking for how clever the creators were at getting them to become iconic. And then we try to bake that into what we're doing at a sort of inspirational level. So the key thing that really we took out of it was design with attitude. And the great thing about working internally for ourselves was we didn't have to do these really elaborate, super resolved design pieces for a client. We could work quite fast and quick and dirty to explore a lot of range of options. And because we're the ones sort of determining whether they are good or not, we could afford to work a lot looser, which kind of gave us a tremendous amount of freedom to explore some really quite out there ideas. Izzy was one of the main forerunner characters for this. So she's kind of more of she's a rich heiress kind of character. I think she's kind of part European, part Latino from memory. It's been a few years since I looked up her background. And so she's mixed culture, and she's kind of like the black sheep of the family. She's kind of like cutting herself off from the family fortune to try find her own way. So she's a real sort of black sheep kind of rebel kind of character. And we kind of figured she might be the protagonist of a script if we were to go that far. So this is actually one of Larry's pieces, trying to capture that attitude, which is the key thing we were trying to look for early on. I was really keen to then start to work up a lineup because we knew that each one of these pilots need to be represented to a faction. So we needed to think about colour, personal costume choices, as costuming is a way of, explaining a character and their role and their personality type, capturing their pose to express who they are as well. Most of these characters I came up with using just sort of some various reference like the previously. Diego, though, Larry had already made a really good start on him, and so I very much just picked up from where he was working and carried on the process. I was also trying to explore a potential more anime style for the characters, so that was something I was pretty keen to do. Main thing here, diversity across the board as much as possible. Age, ethnicity, personality type, just the works, costume, but just creating contrast to create interest. Don't be precious with your designs. At workshop, we regularly work over each other's work. It's just how we get things done. So Christian took my pass and Larry's pass and did his pass, and because he was leading the charge on the robots, we knew, looking at shows like Evangelion, how important the cockpit pilot scenes are. And so we really wanted to make sure that he led that process because he was the one designing a lot of the technology around that. So this is his pass of taking the characters, I designed them in their civvies, and this is Christian taking those into the pilot suits and how that might work. But at the same time, he's still evolving the characters. He didn't like my take on Sun, and so he's working up his version. With Kanika, he liked aspects of what I was doing, but he decided to take some inspiration from a real-life Formula One driver. And also, we like the idea of Kanika being a military veteran, so potentially giving us some prosthetic legs, and just working with some other fresh concepts. And this is how we find, through collaboration, a better and more interesting character. Thinking things through. Again, we want to maybe look at sort of taking this into comics or animated TV. We didn't want to lock ourselves into a situation where we hadn't thought it through. Even though you'd never go into this much detail on a board game, this was kind of purely us doing what we do on live action films, which is exploring the importance of exploring this kind of detailing to make sure that you're future-proofing and getting a sound concept for the future. Wrong direction, there we go. And speaking of planning for the future, this is just a good example of that. To get style consistency, because we wanted to look at comics and animation, we needed to come up with a pipeline. So the 2D design got made into a 3D model, pretty standard. From the 3D model, we experimented with some rendering and art passes in Photoshop to create a more line-based comic book sort of style look that suited some of the halftone stuff that we were doing. And then from there, we started to test those characters in a kind of like a day in the life kind of moment. And this is a big thing for us. It's all good and fine thinking about characters from a role and archetype perspective, but sometimes what makes a character real is the little things, or thinking about that character in a day in the life, like getting out of bed, what do they eat for breakfast, who do they hang out with, where do they like to drink, what hijinks do they get up to when they're not piloting a heavy hitter. And these were all aspects that I explored in these quick sort of key scenes, I guess, very quick monochromatic key scenes. But the whole purpose of them was to see whether the characters we were designing felt right and that there was a story there. We just needed to write the story, but they felt like really interesting characters. And so sometimes doing this day in the life exercise is really helpful. So there's the final lineup for the first lot of pilots we did. Luckily, the Kickstarter did really well, and we were able to unlock another round of pilots. And so this time we explored a Polynesian character, Marlo, a Middle Eastern inspired character called Anna, and then we actually got in our production manager, Nicola, and Ike. We used them for inspiration for 2 of the pilots as a kind of thank you for all the work that they did on the project, which was a lot of fun. So these were quite loose designs. At the time we were in the middle of film work and a lot of play testing. So I just belted these out and then handed them over to our amazing sculptors, Lindsay Crummett and Lena Lazar, to resolve the detailing and design and take them through to a really beautiful 3D finish, which we then put through our rendering process to get the consistent stylistic look we were after. But also we were able to take those models and turn them into playable miniatures for the game as well, which was really fun. Right, world, cracking on. So for us, the world for now very much was the board game, and the part of the world that you explore through the board game, which is these ruined cities. In our story, we had these utopian brand new cities that were, really interesting. New Tokyo from Akira, kind of amazing. But unfortunately, we did have a budget, and that was less important to just resolving what the battleground looked like. These abandoned cities that we'd gotten rid of, these resources that were just sitting there ready for a giant demolition party and salvaging. So contrast. That was the name of the game for the board and also our exploration of the world in some ways. When we went around conventions, looked at other games and played other board games, we noticed a few things. One, a lot of the board games were super colourful, kind of in a good way, but also everyone was doing it, and it was really you didn't even know where to look sometimes. Also, there was very few games that exploited verticality at the time. And considering we were trying to do these massive giant robots fighting out in massive cities, the thought of being able to represent that on a board was super exciting. And so that's a big part of what we did with our world exploration, was how do we capture a really interesting look, stylized look for a city that could be translated into more of a component for a board game. And even better, have the componentry demolish so that the skyline literally changes as the game moves towards a conclusion. So color control was huge for us in terms of contrast. We made the call that unless it was something to do with corporation advertising or factions, it would be in monochromatic grey. So anything, and factions would very strictly adhere to their color scheme. So we took a nod out of films like Sin City, for instance, that kind of very isolated color as a way of creating some extreme contrast and interest. And for us, it was, we spilled that into our wider IP as well. And in fact, even the Kickstarter video, we tried to stick to it as much as possible. Of course, we were setting up a bit of a gag with our Kickstarter video. We wanted everyone to think this was going to be another Terminator 2, post-apocalyptic, very serious kind of world. And so it needed to look like that, and it does look cool. But then, of course, we wanted to flip that expectation and actually, no, it's actually bright and colourful, and it's quite utopian. And this is actually a sporting arena, not a war zone. Getting your designs into the world. This is a great exercise Larry did on the right, taking a lot of the designs and iconography we're designing for the factions and placing them into cultural context. We didn't like the idea of slums in our world, but we did like the idea that outside of the really big cities, there were people living a simpler life that were less corporate controlled. And these could be the characters that kind of potentially lead more of a rebellion against the corporations. And maybe they do that through the game. And so one of the things we did was this exercise of placing designs into real world photos. This was done purely as an internal exercise. And, certainly something that we would never normally show to a client or anything like that if it was a live job. But what it does do is it just road tests the validity of the design direction that we're going in. And also we're really interested to explore beyond just this idea of these heavy hitters fighting it out in this ruined cities. We love the idea of a whole, that the sport dominates all aspects of society, and that there are smaller leagues, leagues where kids are playing with homemade robots, finding it out. Or there is a video game league where someone like Diego, coming from a simpler background, can actually fight his way to the very top, where he actually now has to go from being a video game player into actually piloting a real heavy hitter. So those are the kind of story arcs we're excited to look at. The other way we explored our world was taking stills from our comic and colouring them up a bit and turning them into more of a moment from an animated TV series, and working with Chris Williamson to try to create a bit of parallax, bit of simple animation using our 3D models and some of our 2D assets like their characters, to see if we could cheat more of an animated approach to what was going to be our Kickstarter video. We didn't have the budget to do a fully animated sequence, but we could maybe do halfway there, and see if we could bring that world to life. Speaking of bringing things to life, Christian embarked on a series of key scenes for each faction. The whole purpose of this was to continue to keep exploring the world of these heavy hitters, and you're going to be used as kind of major promotional assets for the product. But more importantly, we were looking to use them for key scene illustrations for potentially a script if we got that far. But also we constructed them in a way that they could be layered with real 3D assets and animated, and which we definitely used. King Wolf was the pioneer on that. And so we could try to use a limited 2D, 3D animation process to try to bring some of these iconic fight scenes to life for the Kickstarter video. And this is just showing the continuation of that world exploration with in terms of design aesthetic and style. Right, your audience, and how do you reach them? And perhaps more importantly, how do you sell yourself in a nice way? Because, no one likes getting sold stuff and being bombarded to buy stuff. If you're going to do it, we try to do it in a fun way, in a nice way, an engaging way, something that's kind of fun. And so that was a big part of our approach, was how do we somehow engage with our audience, but in a way that they want to engage with us rather than just us feeling like we're selling them a product. Because let's face it, we're all consumers and we're all fickle. We give our loyalty to different brands, and we might be following one brand one day and then ditch it for another. So how do you create that loyalty and keep those people invested in what you're doing? Well, good question. One of the ways we wanted to communicate our products was to be very consistent, and to try to always bring an element of the world into it. And so what we did is we kind of tried to stay in character with a lot of our advertising. A lot of our copy was literally like an ad. Like if you were in that world, this would probably be an ad that you would get. So we actually tried to stay in character. But one of the big things is we were very consistent around our graphic design, our color use, and our use of quotes, in-world quotes, for a lot of our 2D marketing stuff. Delivering on the promise of the premise, we've already briefly mentioned it. This is the giant killer robot that we took to Comic-Con and other conventions like Gen Con, I think, or I think was the other one. It was probably about 4 foot high, and quite the mission to assemble, but absolutely amazing. So cool. I mean, that's obviously one of the huge benefits of working at a physical effects company like Wētā, where we have the most phenomenal people that can actually take a design and make it the most amazingly realistic thing that you could imagine, and then actually share it with everyone at a show. So that was very cool. So yeah, the trick is, if you're going to build an IP, try to find ways where you can deliver on the premise as much as possible. And there's just some awesome pics from the show, from the various shows that we went to. This is just a tiny selection. But what was really cool was seeing how fans engaged with us each year. The more we had to show, the more excited they got, the more excited we got. We even started getting people cosplaying as some of the pilots, which was just so cool. And it kind of gave us a renewed sense of purpose, because obviously making an IP is, especially when you're working on films and other jobs at the same time, it can be pretty exhausting, but it kind of really carried us through. So big ups to the fans. A big thing for us at Wētā is art before product. And this is something Richard's always been really big on, is we are artists first. And that means that we always want to be artist-led. That does not mean we want to, that we don't want to make money, but it just means that we want to always try to keep a level of artistic authenticity to what we do and lead with that, and hope that if it is successful and exceptional, that it will make the money. And so this was actually a gallery show that we did for GKR. We knew that we needed to engage in a commercial way with some of the shows, but we thought, how cool would it be if we actually did more of an art-based gallery show first, to showcase off all of our hard work in a more artistic setting and celebrate that. And so that was a really awesome evening. It was up for a couple of weeks, and just gave us a chance to kind of road test a lot of the stuff that we would then take literally on the road to the US in a more commercial sense. Right. Conventions. Well, basically they're awesome. I think if you're serious about making an IP and getting an IP noticed, it is certainly probably one of the best ways of doing that. And I think the biggest thing is just putting yourself out there. And I mean, it's creative risk taking, but I think you've just got to go for it. And whether it's at a very small scale, and we started very small, and then maybe working your way up to something bigger. But the main thing is just engaging, meeting people, talking to them, asking them what they like, what they don't like, having those chance encounters with someone from industry at maybe quite a senior level who might be prepared to stop and give you some advice. We had all of those kind of people help us, and it made our IP so much better for it. So go to conventions is all I can say. And the other thing is, don't just go to conventions. Go to your fans directly. We were novices in the board game community. Cryptozoic wasn't, but Wētā Workshop definitely was. And we may have some street cred when it comes to film work, but we certainly didn't think that we could take anything for granted when we came into the board game community. And I'm always a big believer in just getting out there and meeting people person to person. And so one of the ideas I pitched to the company was, well, if we're going to these shows, rather than flying our crew and gear from location to location, like San Diego to Atlanta, well then why don't we do a road trip and because I used to do road trips in Europe all the time. So why don't we do a road trip and visit a whole bunch of game stores and show them our game and get their feedback? And this is very much a case of don't take shortcuts. I mean, I think you can make a lot of assumptions around what people think of your product. But it's a very different thing when you actually take it to them and ask them on their home turf. And this was one of the hardest things I think any of the team did. Like Larry, Ike, and our friend Johnny just about killed themselves in 49-degree desert heat. They were driving all day, play testing all day, and then editing to the more small hours of the morning, particularly Ike, in order to try to get an episode up on YouTube for the following day. So this was brutal, but it was also one of the most amazing things. And the feedback and the friends that we got out of it was off the charts. So I guess the takeaway here is try to think of a really authentic and meaningful way of connecting with people as an artist and as a creator, and try to do something different. Just have some fun, but then know how to take that fun and make it relevant as a learning process back to your IP. As I said earlier, staying in character was our way of engaging in a fun and authentic way. We tried to do it as much as possible. We tried to not use photos of ourselves in our campaign as much as possible. And even when we did, we tried to do it in a kind of a goofy kind of in-world way where we'd use some of our corporate graphics and logos to kind of literally deface and devalue and graffiti our photos, which was kind of fun. But when it came to advertising our product, we always tried to generally do that in world as much as possible, which came down to some really clever copywriting by people like Liana. It came down to some really great graphic design and coming up with a cast of sort of corporate characters that we could sell through. So this is where that whole kind of parody of reality TV and infomercials came in, which traced all the way back to the love of Paul Van Hoven films like RoboCop and Starship Troopers, those crazy ads that you would get halfway through the film. This was us taking that inspiration and running with it. And the more that we got into it, the more that people got into it, which made us get into it more. And it was this kind of snowballing effect, which made for a really fun campaign. And hopefully, I think a huge part of the reason why we did as well as we did. So try to find a unique way of finding your voice within the market. Right, getting towards the end. I think another thing I want to touch on is value your friends, partners, and supporters. They sustain you during the inevitable tough times. GKR was, for most of us, one of the hardest things we'd ever done, which is bizarre thinking on some of the films we've made, been a part of. But it's true. It was absolutely grueling a lot of the time. And also there was some frustrating setbacks along the way. And so we tried to own those as much as we could as a company and make good on the mistakes that we made. But it was stressful. But through it all, we had this constant support from friends, partners, and fans that helped keep picking us up and moving us forward. And I think if you're going to create an IP, a huge part of that is if you want to do a good job, you've got to take risks, which means you've got to really put yourself out there emotionally, which is making you very vulnerable. But at the same time, I don't think you can do a really good job without taking that level of risk. But it does get tough. And so this is where relying on that support base is really important. Finding those good people around you to help you, to give you that good advice when you get stuck. So, so just sort of value that and cherish it and look for it when you start building your IP. Okay, well, what next? It's a good question because for us, myself, Larry, and Christian, our involvement with the IP kind of finished with the launch of the Kickstarter. That core team, creative development team, that was us finishing kind of our role primarily, other than to do what we could to support our consumer products division in creating additional content for the Kickstarter and just trying to be supportive as possible. But the delivery of the Kickstarter, the manufacturing process, all of that huge amount of work for the product aspect of it was done by our colleagues and friends in the consumer products part of the company, and our fabricating and all of those amazing people in the factories that made this amazing game. And our expectation was we were looking forward, due to the success of the game, we were looking forward to doing a lot more. And we did do our first expansion pack with our Sweet and Salty robot companion pack. And we, of course, were always looking forward to the idea of expanding the IP into, I think our first step was going to be looking at comics. However, what ended up happening was that we got super busy on a whole bunch of films, and myself, Larry, and Christian ended up back in the design studio working full-time on service work again. And one of the other reasons for that sort of lack of progress on GKR was that Richard, our boss, Richard, had this amazing idea for something called Wētā Workshop Unleashed, which was a location-based experience that was going to be located in Auckland and was all about primarily getting children and kids into an experience that would unlock their creativity. And at the same time share the Wētā Workshop story, like what we do and how we do it. And being a company of, finite resources, we realised that we probably couldn't do GKR and Unleashed at the same time. And Unleashed at the end of the day was going to be something that was going to be providing a lot more work and potentially a lot more opportunity than GKR in the short term. And so Christian, in fact, had a lot to do with creating this project, which launched, I think, last year. And so, obviously, COVID has had a bit of an impact on not just Unleashed, but also our plans now for GKR. But we are very hopeful that we will be getting back onto GKR in a more substantial way in the very near future. And we've already been working on some other products, mainly in the sort of video game space. But so I guess at this stage it's just a case of watch this space. I'd like to finish this talk mainly just with a quick thank you. I'm going to play the thank you video that we did for our supporters and fans and Kickstarter backers, because that's really, for me, the best way of summing up our thoughts around the experience we had making GKR and just wanting to say thank you back. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope this has been at some level informative. Take care, stay safe, and happy journeys creating. Bye.